Well, good evening, and thank you all for joining us. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. My name is Frank Bowles. I'm the director of the Clarke Library. And thanks for joining us for the Clarke Library Speaker Series for this fall semester. As you all know, we're going to be doing them online every Thursday at 7 p.m., so take a look for some other ones that will be upcoming. Tonight, Professors Alton and Gretchen Papazian are going to be talking about the surprise and wonder of pop-up books. They curated the exhibit for us, for which we are extremely grateful. I should also mention, as a piece of housekeeping, we've muted all your mics. So if you're out there listening to this and you're going to want to ask a question, if you would please use the chat feature, I'll take some notes and put questions to the two presenters at the end of the presentation. We're doing that because, as you all know, the robocalls are going out, the phones are ringing for the politicians of your choice, and lots of other distractions occur. So we're just cutting back on the feedback. So with that, as a very brief introduction, let me turn the program over to, I think, Gretchen, you're starting, right?
That is correct. Okay. So Ann and I have about 30 minutes of talking planned, and then we want to give over the rest of the session to questions and discussion. So our talk's going to start with a bit of background information that I'll be presenting, and then Professor Alton is going to give a brief tour of the exhibit. And then we're going to shift into more of a conversational mode where we'll talk together about the processes involved in curating the exhibit itself. So I'm going to start by sharing a PowerPoint. Can you see it? I can see nothing.
Yes, it's working.
Thank you. Okay. So the first part of our presentation lays out some of the things that we'd like you to know about pop-up books and their history. We are, after all, scholars and at a university, and we not only like to know things, but we like others to know things. And as such, knowledge and education were a large part of our thinking in the designing of the exhibit. So to begin, we need to think about some definitions. There are a number of different words that people use to describe the kinds of books that the exhibit centers on. The most common being movable books or pop-up books, which actually means slightly different things, though most regular people use them pretty interchangeably. At their core, when we use those terms, what we mean is a kind of print media in the form of bound together pages known as a codex. Pop-up books are distinct from other codexes, though, in that they contain parts that can be tangibly manipulated by the reader-viewer-interactor, sometimes as a means of engaging the reader-viewer-interactor in a story, but other times as a means of sharing information or as a means of initiating play. While they are an important kind of contemporary children's book, and though many people think of them only as a kind of children's book, pop-up books actually also have a much deeper history, and in fact, when one starts to really look at them, one finds they have a much broader place in our contemporary moment as well, including occupying a seat at the table besides other kinds of interactive media, such as games, hypertext, and digital storytelling and information sharing instruments. The first mechanical books date to the 13th century. The book that's most often cited as the first mechanical book is a book by a man named Matthew Paris. Paris was a British monk and a scribe, and in one of the books that he was working on in around 1240, he was looking to convey Christian holy dates. His problem, of course, is that many of those dates change every year, and so how could he create a fixed trapped-in-print list? He solved his problem by cutting out a circle and laying it over another circle that was drawn on the page in his book. Then he pinned the two together in the middle so that the cutout circle could freely rotate and different bits of information on it could align with information on the page. We've all seen this technology, perhaps in the form of those night sky star guides that seem to show up in our lives now and again, or maybe in the form of some sort of secret decoder. Nonetheless, Paris's use of this device, known as a volvel, it existed before Paris, but he was the first to include it in a book. And Paris's use stands as the first documented use of a mechanical interactive component in a book. Between the 13th century and the 21st century, a lot has changed in the ways that we think about things, in the ways that we think about books, and in the ways that we make books. That's kind of an enormous understatement. It's 800 years after all. But in any case, following Matthew Paris's use of the Vowel, and as book technologies advanced, mechanical devices such as pull tabs, dissolving slats, and flaps began to be used in various ways to convey various kinds of information. But by the late 18th century, bookmakers began to experiment with such devices for the purposes of entertainment and storytelling, specifically, although not only entertainment and stories for children. English printer Robert Sayer is often mentioned here as one of the first to start to print a kind of book known as the Harlequinade, or a turn-up book, which allowed readers to surprise reveal the story in their reading, and or read the book in more of a make-your-own story from the available components way. Techniques that, of course, appear pretty prominently in various kinds of interactive text today, including but not only pop-up books. Paper doll books, dollhouse books, movable theater books also began to appear around this time, while many people enjoyed tunnel books, also known as peep show books. And while there are some more adult kinds of peep show books, the term is actually meant to refer to early stereoscope technologies wherein a person would look into a box to observe a scene. As important as these types of books are, though, is the name Dean & Sons, a publisher who in the mid-1800s claimed itself to be the originator of children's movable books. And while this is not exactly true, Dean & Son did have a significant impact on the movable book. Not only did they publish nearly 70 books with a variety of kinds of moving parts, but they also established a special department of skilled craftspeople in their workshop who prepared the handmade mechanisms. In this, they claimed movable books as a division of book production, rather than, say, toy production. Skipping over a bunch of time and important figures like Ernest Nister, Raphael Tuck, and the most original picture bookmaker of the 19th century, C. Lothar Meggendorfer, he was in Germany. I want to pause briefly on the efforts of early 20th century British book publisher S. Lewis Gerard, who is notable for a number of innovations in the form, some technological and some related to business practices. Gerard's technological innovations include being the first to use what he called living models, but which we would recognize as true pop-ups. That is, pictures that have complex folding mechanisms that enable them to rise up off of the page, often in coordination with the page opening. As important as these innovations in mechanics, though, are Gerard's efforts to shift the market of movable books by reducing production costs, using cheaper paper and labor, making them affordable for a wider population. Gerard's efforts paved the way for companies like Blue Ribbon Books, an American company which at the height of the Great Depression in the 1930s sought to rekindle book buying through pop-up books. In fact, Blue Ribbon Books was the first publisher to use the term pop-up, effectively renaming the format. Many of Blue Ribbon's books feature the paper engineering of a man named Harold Lentz, but more importantly, perhaps, was the company's relationship with the Disney Corporation, which then established pop-ups as a kind of conduit for advertising, as well as transmedia storytelling. As pop-up innovations and technologies move forward towards the 21st century, we see the work of Klein jump-up books, which innovatively used die-cut technology to print on a single piece of paper that was then cut and folded to form a three-dimensional scene. In this mid-century period, we also find the work of Julian Ware, best known for the complex animations he created through the use of pull tabs and internal connections that generated more coordinated and lifelike movements. And we see the work of the remarkable and much reproduced Czechoslovakian paper engineer Vijátek Kubasta. Finally, here, as we move into the 70s and 80s, we find pop-up series by both Random House and the Hallmark Company. Hallmark also started doing pop-up cards around this time, establishing pop-ups as a staple of the stationery business. Shifting from these more commercial branded endeavors, there is a kind of radical revival of the pop-up as art in the mid to late 1980s. Arguably beginning in earnest when a British children's book, The Haunted House, written by Jan Piankowski and illustrated and paper engineered by Tor Lochvig, won the coveted Kate Greenaway Medal. In our 21st century contemporary moment, we continue to see the range of pop-up mechanics being used in various ways: advertisements, cards, storybooks to illustrate how things work. But we have also entered a time wherein we begin to really find the wonder and delight of contemporary pop-ups in the artistry and innovation of paper engineers such as Robert Sabuda, Courtney Watson McCarthy, David Pelham, David Carter, Jane McTeague, Becca Zirkin, and of course Matthew Reinhardt, who not only features prominently in our exhibit, but who we will get to interact with next Thursday at 7 o'clock via WebEx. This here is the exact place, though, to shift attention to the exhibit itself, which Professor Alton is going to give us a walkthrough of, before we then together talk for a few minutes about the processes of selecting the materials for the exhibit. And it's going to take us just a second, I think, to switch over PowerPoint. So.
Okay. Theoretically, I have the control. We're about to find out if this will work. The first thing I'm going to do is share my screen with you so that you can see a variety of things in our exhibit. So, welcome to the virtual tour of the Surprise and Wonder of Pop-Up Books. As you walk into the exhibit, you'll see immediately to your left the oldest book featured. This is Peter Appian's Cosmographia, published in 1524, which includes an example of the vowels that Professor Papazian was discussing. These are the movable discs, like little wheels that can rotate, and if you look carefully, you can see the pin that keeps it in place. Keep walking, and you'll enter the Meyer Gallery, which focuses on the history and development of pop-up books, and has examples of some of their mechanics. Many of the books in here are ones that Professor Papazian mentioned, including the Blue Ribbon books. For example, you'll see one of the early Blue Ribbon books by Harold B. Lenz, Pinocchio, which was published in 1932. In addition, we have the Blue Ribbon Minnie Mouse and Mickey Mouse, created in collaboration with the Disney Studios the following year. There's also a case devoted to toy books and theater books. For instance, on the right is the McLaughlin Brothers' Cinderella, a very early example of a book that became a theater set when opened up to a 90-degree angle. The purpose of this was to display interior scenes and give the illusion of depth. This was one of the first constructions to be used for pop-up books after the Wavels. We also have Julian Weir's Snow White, along with Santa's Circus and the Speaking Picture book. Santa's Circus was created in the 1950s when Charlot Bayeye and Beth Varden collaborated on a series of unusual spiral-bound Christmas books, each issued in a cardboard box. The books included a number of related objects, things like a plastic spoon or a toy parachute, and as you can see here, sometimes they contained edible candy. The Speaking Picture book was first published in Germany in 1880, and then later published in English, French, and Spanish editions. This was one of the most ingenious toy books of its time. It has been referred to as the pièce de résistance of any collection of movable or toy books. It's classified as a noisy book because it has miniature bellows built in with strings you pull to make animal noises that correspond with some of the pictures. This copy, published around 1900, was repaired by a craftsman in Ann Arbor who added the glass-backed end page. You can't quite see it because it's transparent, in order to display the movable mechanism. When you visit the exhibit, you can take a look at a short video clip on one of the iPads to actually see it in action. In this gallery, there are also a number of contemporary books chosen to demonstrate different kinds of paper engineering. For instance, John Summers' Henri Rousseau Tunnel Book is an example of a peep show book, which seems to have evolved from traveling peep shows that showmen took to fairs and festivals. You'll see here how the accordion design creates the depth, and then you look through it there. In addition, we chose a book called Sailing Ships by Ron Vandemere, Ellen Patrick McGowan, Jorge Svensson, John Strahan, and David Rosendale. I mention all of the names just to give you a sense of how much collaborative work goes into creating a pop-up book. So for example, here, McGowan is one of the authors, Vandemere is the other author and the book designer, Svensson is the illustrator, and Strahan and Rosendale are the paper engineers. This one is really huge. I mean, it's really quite large. It's really detailed, and yet it still folds out very tidily afterwards. As you come back into the Molson Gallery, you'll see a blow-up of a scene from Robert Sabuta's Wizard of Oz. Sabuta is one of the best-known contemporary pop-up artists, and many people will recognize his take on the iconic Tea Party scene from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Just around the corner is a case with additional model and toy books that includes Choo Choo Charlie, a Little Town Train, published in 1997. The book was sold with a miniature wind-up train engine that does travel around the track, and yes, we did test it. One of the iPads also shows how this works. In addition, there's a book detailing Leonardo da Vinci's inventions. Next to it is one of my favorite books in the whole collection. It's called This Book is a Planetarium. The book has working paper models of a musical instrument, a decoder ring, which uses vowels, a perpetual calendar, a spiral graph, and also a mini planetarium. You can see it here. But the way that it works is you take it into a dark room with a flashlight or your phone, turn it on, shine it up through the holes in the paper, and it projects onto the ceiling a map of the stars. As you go deeper into the Molson Gallery, the focus shifts into storytelling, and you'll see classic literary works adapted into pop-ups. This includes Sam Ita's version of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Sam Ita's really re-envisioning the pop-up format today. His work draws inspiration from comics, origami, machineries, advertising, and animation, as well as display and toy design. In applying his skill to books, he combines comic-style storytelling with pop-up mechanics to create intricate and innovative pop-up graphic novels that result in story experiences that are simultaneously visual, literal, and tactile. Here you'll also see two well-known poems adapted to pop-ups by Nick Bantock, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan and Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. We also have Lulu Hanson's Fishing for the Moon and other Zen stories. Fittingly, these illustrations seem quieter and not as colorful as many of the other books on display, but it nevertheless conveys a sense of peace. It also highlights the many ways in which stories hold meanings that stretch across centuries and cultures. Moving into the top part of the gallery, on the right, we have a case dedicated to contemporary artist Matthew Reinhardt's work, and on the left, a case of books that were used for various marketing purposes. As Professor Papazian mentioned, Matthew Reinhardt will be speaking here, speaking via WebEx about his work for the Clarke Speaker Series next week at 7 p.m. Thursday evening on WebEx. In terms of marketing, pop-up books have been used to accompany products. They've been used as souvenirs, and they've been manufactured as part of fandom culture. You'll see Bruce Foster's Peanuts, a pop-up collection, alongside Kees Moorbach's Neiman Marcus pop-up book. This was their holiday catalog from 2007. Finally, we have a few cases that feature significant figures and, often at the same time, show off how pop-ups are works of art. For example, this is Susumu Shingu's Le Voyage du Vent. Shingu is known as a kinetic sculptor who usually works on really big projects. He has many, many outdoor sculptures. His work is often inspired by air and water and wind. He started publishing pop-up books relatively recently, in 2014, but he has been known as a popular children's author in Japan since the 1970s. We have Anouk Boisrobert and Louis Rigaud, Wake Up Sloth. I actually prefer the French title of this, which is Dans la forêt de Perceau, which is in the lazy forest. Boisrobert and Rigaud have published some of the more intriguing pop-up works of the 21st century. Boisrobert's bold colors and clean lines provide a perfect canvas for Rigaud's innovative paper engineering, and their work has been praised for its stylish and ingenious nature. In addition to their pop-up collaborations, they have recently begun experimenting with interactive electronic books for readers of all ages, thus extending what we might traditionally think of as a pop-up text. We also have Yevhenia Yartskaya's Snowflakes. Yartskaya is a Ukrainian-born artist who does, I think, just exquisite work. These look really simple, but when you look at them a little bit more closely, they are extremely detailed. We have Ernest Heikels and Mike Biederstadt's Creatures of the Deep. Heikels is a scientist. Biederstadt is a paper engineer and illustrator. And Biederstadt worked with Heikels to transform his photographic images into a pop-up format. Finally, we have a work by Philippe Hug. This is called Funny Birds. It was published in 2013. Hug is the pen name of Philippe Huger. He's a graphic designer and cartoonist, and I think he's doing some of the more interesting work today in pop-up art and paper engineering. The exhibit is still open by appointment. It will be here till December. To see it, all you need to do is call the Clarke Library and they will book you an appointment. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn this back to Gretchen to talk for a little bit.
And so the last part of the formal presentation, before we turn to questions, we've sketched out a kind of conversation between us in order to talk a little bit about the process of curating the exhibit. And so we're going to start by having Anne just talk a little bit more freeform about how we got involved with doing the exhibits in the first place.
So about 18 months ago, I think in the spring of 2020, Frank Bowles, whom you just met, who introduced us, he's the director of the Clarke Library. And he mentioned that he was talking with Dr. Francis Molson, the former chair of the English department, who's now retired, about acquiring his collection of pop-up books. At that point, Frank wondered whether we would be interested in working on an exhibit that focused on pop-up books, assuming the Clarke Library was able to acquire the collection and add it to their own of 300 or 400 pop-up books. We discussed it and said yes, and then when the books arrived in June, we went over to see them. At that point, they were not cataloged, they were just in a whole bunch, well, actually they were not properly cataloged, they were in a bunch of boxes. We went over and looked at the boxes, but we were also given a spreadsheet with the over 700 books from Dr. Molson's collection. Our work over the next few months happened separately, and Gretchen started it because I was going away for a bit. And so maybe Gretchen, you could talk a bit about how you proceeded.
So the first part of our work in sorting and evaluating and assessing this rather large collection that was in cardboard moving boxes was that we sat down together and we looked at a couple of books to try to establish a set of criteria through which we'd approach and evaluate the books. And then we put together a sheet that we had planned to fill out on each book as they were read. And then we separated. As I started to work with the books, I quickly realized that filling out this sheet of paper on each book was far too complicated and time consuming, and we would never get through looking at all of the books if we were doing it that way. So instead, I just started reading each book and trying to sort the collection kind of roughly into big groupings based on common features, ideas, or types. Trying to figure out what we had, what was interesting, what was special, what we might want to highlight for the exhibit. And so then I went on and spent most of the summer reading pop-up books. It went on, I went in for several hours, a couple times a week, and it was frankly a really lovely way to spend my summer. I mean, these books, right, are intended to surprise and delight, and it was just such a cheerful, like, research thing to get to do. At the same time, I was researching various resources for information, including the archive put together by the Movable Book Society, as well as collecting scholarship on pop-up books. So I read about their history, I read about the development of various technologies that make them possible, I read about various ways of thinking about and understanding them as a kind of book and technology. some of the most interesting, at least to me, discoveries in all of that was the way that some of the scholarship looks at pop-up books in terms of old things, and things like the educational philosophies of John Locke, and how these books highlight opportunities for what we now call active learning. And so John Locke, and as the pop-up books returning to children's culture kind of coincides, and people talk about that. The other sort of branch of scholarship that really caught my attention looks at them in relationship to very recent things, and other kinds of interactive text like video games. In fact, there's a whole set of video game scholars who are very, very interested in pop-up books right now. As part of this work as well, I also looked into other exhibits that have been mounted. Most notably, was an exhibit in New York put together by the Brooklyn Public Library System in 2000, and there was an exhibit in Washington, D.C. created by the Smithsonian Libraries that was open the 2011-2012 years. And then Anne's process was a little bit different, and so she's gonna talk a little bit about what she did in terms of her process and timeline.
Yeah, so I got back the end of July, and Gretchen and I, we met in early August, and she talked a little bit about what she had done and had this treasure trove of criticism and said, yeah, don't read that one, that wasn't useful, this was really helpful. So that was incredibly time-saving. So I read the criticism, and then I went in, well, not, and then at the same time I went in and did much the same as Gretchen did, read the books, a couple of times a week, found out she was indeed absolutely dead on with those forms were not going to work. So I did the same thing, just took notes. The really nice thing, I think, during that month of August was the two of us were going in, but at different times. But we could leave notes for each other and say, oh, look at this one, or text each other and say, oh, I discovered something, this was fun. So there were a couple of books that we each discovered and were able to share with the other one. Say, okay, we really like that, I like this one. So we kept doing that during the rest of August. Classes started in late August, and so then it was juggling the classes and juggling the research. I'd like to add how very helpful the Clarke staff were. The student assistants were just marvelous. We would go in and need something, say, oh, I'll get it for you, and they would be really happy about going and finding things. Krista Clare, often she's an assistant who works in the Clarke Library. She often met me at 8 o'clock and let me in first thing in the morning before the Clarke opened, so that I could get some of the research done before classes began. By the end of September, we were both nearly finished, I think, going through everything and starting to get some ideas about how we might shape the exhibits and what kinds of categories did we want to highlight. And of course, we had too many. We had a plan to start with, and then we kind of tore it up and began again because there were certain things we thought were really important to talk about. So the broad categories that you saw, things like history and mechanics and art, and I think there was a section on education that may not have made it in there, but we managed to filter them in other places. A lot of that managed to get into the exhibit, but then it was figuring out how the layout was going to work. And that was not just about us, that was about other people. And so I want to bat it back to Gretchen and let her talk about that.
So interwoven with a lot of the work that Anne was doing, we began to do together some work with Janet Danek. And so Janet Danek is the artistic designer for all of the exhibits and displays at the library. So all of the beautiful displays that are mounted in the Baber Room, all of the displays in the Clarke, and all of the sort of smaller displays that are mounted within the library itself. Those are all Janet's work. She's very knowledgeable and talented, and we are grateful for her experience with designing and mounting displays of all sorts. As we began to work with Janet, we began, as Anne pointed out, to really pin down what we would include in the exhibit. Janet was asking us to really think about the space and to try and think about organizing the exhibit visually, as well as in terms of some of the thematic content that we were thinking about. So based on what we saw as important, what we wanted to draw attention to in terms of the collection as well. We wanted to think about what was important about the pop-up book as a kind of book. So it was like all of these different pieces that were circulating. And we narrowed things down to about 6 things that we really wanted to highlight in the exhibit. History, art, story, important contemporary paper engineers. which we also think are some places that the collection itself that Dr. Molson donated, or well, that we acquired from Dr. Molson, are places where the collection really shines. We then had this kind of marathon weekend where John First, who is one of the Clarke's librarians and is also just a helpful human who is very generous with his time. John met us. He opened the library at a time when the Clarke is usually closed, and he helped pull out all of the carts with all of the moving boxes full of books on them. And then Anne and I spent a very long time sorting 1,000 books, pulling the items we thought would be important to put on display, grouping them into sort of sets of things that would work well together. And again, it was extremely hard to choose. And we probably chose about 1/3 more than we needed to for the exhibit, but we wanted to be able to give Janet enough things to be able to swap out for different kinds of limits of display. Like we only have cases with so much clearance, like those kinds of things. So we wanted to give her some options. And from those materials, then Janet was able to choose a few pieces as well to turn into life-size display pieces in order to try to really emphasize the drama of the book form. And then Anne's going to talk a little bit more, I think, about the mounting display and some of the interactive components of the exhibit.
Yeah. So the mounting and display, I think, is something that I certainly hadn't thought about when putting this together. Were just the mechanics of how do you display a pop-up book. Part of the fun of pop-ups is that they move, right? So you open them and you can close them, or you can look at them from different angles. And as Gretchen said, Janet was really helpful by saying, oh, we can order these special cases, or we can get certain cases, or we can put some on open shelves. Then we started talking about how to make the exhibit a little more interactive. Some of the books, of course, we don't want people to touch because they are ancient, and pop-up books often don't survive very long because if you give them to people who play with them a lot, of all ages, they aren't necessarily as strong as other kinds of toys. But we also wanted to not take away the enjoyment of movable books from people who were going to come and see it. Somebody came up with the idea of iPads being placed strategically around the exhibit so people could see how some of the books, especially some of the older ones like the speaking picture book, to see how that worked. So somebody filmed it and then it's on, and there are iPads, 3 or 4 of them throughout the exhibit that you can go and tap on and see how certain things work. For the newer books, the Clarke purchased duplicates of a variety of duplicates, and now have them available throughout the exhibit on movable carts so that people can handle them and see for themselves how they work. One of the things that we noticed throughout this process is how much an exhibit is a process, how much it's, as Gretchen put it, actually a living thing. They keep changing, they keep being tinkered with right up to the time they open, sometimes right past the time that they open. We also got a sense of that exhibits are like pop-up books. They are collaborative projects. All of the Clarke Library staff, in one way or another, worked on this. They put the magnets in place to hold paper open, or they ordered things, or they rearranged things, or they lifted things across the room. Here, we'd like to especially thank Brian Whitledge. He not only had some really great ideas about how to write certain books, but he located a copy of Peter Appian's Cosmographia. This is the 16th century book with favels at the University of Michigan, and he arranged for its loan to us. So thank you for that, Brian, and for doing all of the little things behind the scenes that we appreciate.
And the Vauvel serves as one of kind of 2 endpoints or bookends to the exhibit's timeline. So that's like the earliest thing, and that's one of the things that we display prominently and that we wanted to draw people's attention to. The other thing that we wanted to draw people's attention to really is the contemporary artists like Matthew Reinhardt, who will be here again next Thursday at 7 p.m. We're not sure exactly what he's going to talk about. I'm hoping that we will get a bit of a demo of the engineering behind the paper mechanics, but I guess we'll find out next week. We wanted to end the formal part of our presentation, though, by drawing attention to the fact that one of the most wonderful things about the exhibit and these books is that we can all continue to enjoy, use, and work with them even after the exhibit ends in December. The books in the collection, in fact, or the books on exhibits, in fact, are only a small taste of the very rich and deep collection that CMU now owns, and which offers a lot of great possibilities for research and other kinds of discovery. And so that's sort of the end of what we formally have to say, and we're hoping people have questions or just want to talk about their experiences with pop-up books.
This is, I think, where Frank gets to try to grab back together the.
This is where Frank just found out his unmute button didn't unmute. I apologize. Yes, we do have everybody muted, but I do have a couple of questions that I'll start with, and the two of you can try to answer. The first one is, do pop-up books offer, whoops, someone just typed something and everything jumped. Do pop-up books offer any benefits to children that can't be replicated as effectively by other media?
That to me raises the question about our paper books better than reading an iPad. I think they're different. Well, okay, other media. Let's see. If you take a pop-up book and actually play with it physically, that's a different kind of an experience than watching a video that granted moves, but maybe it's not interactive. I'm not much of a video gamer, and so I would make the argument that playing with a pop-up book might be a different kind of interactive experience than playing a video game. That's a good question. Gretchen, what do you think?
I think it's, again, such a big question, right? You know, what are the benefits of, you know, any media over another media? And I think that, right, you know, the different medium exists because they do different things, right? You know, the medium is the message. And so what is sort of the message that we're getting through a codex form of a toy, or is it a toy? I mean, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not pop-up books are toys or they're art. If they are, again, living models, right? Many of the very first pop-up books were really about being able to share things like medical information in three-dimensional ways, right? So you open the flaps to see, you know, how the body is put together with muscles and organs and skeleton. So can you get that in other ways? Yes, right? But there's also things you can only get in this way. So I don't know, for example, I had a student this morning who's running a lab for an anatomy class, and she was telling me about their a cadaver that they were working on this morning. So they had a dead body, was what she did before my class this morning. And it had been autopsied, but left in the wrong position. So they had to flip over the dead body to be able to look at the thing that they wanted, right? And there's probably no experience like that. But not everybody can have that experience. And so how do you make an experience like that shareable in a different media? Because we can't just be sharing dead bodies. I'm sorry, was this a strange example? I think it was.
That's medical stuff. I think it's really.
Can I ask the next question before we have any more dead body stories?
Oh, come on.
This is a quick one. I got a quick question. Were peep shows just a simple scene or a full story of some sort?
I guess it depends on the book. The Rousseau book is a single scene. I'm trying to think of other ones that I've seen. The ones that I have seen tend to be a single scene. I don't think that the Clarke has that many of them. I don't remember seeing that many of them.
Our library loaned a book over the summer that was dedicated just to peep shows. And I'm trying to remember, it was like a big sort of oversized coffee table book. And I feel like for the most part that the peep show books really were and are kind of about a single moment in time. So, you know, trying to give you a sense of what Mount Rushmore might be like, right? That kind of thing.
Okay, I'm going to add one piece of information. Brian Whitledge is here tonight doing tech support, and he just said, mute your mic. We have a Wizard of Oz that is a peep show book, so there are some that have stories in them.
Ah.
There you go, guys. Talk to Brian. I'm sure he'll be happy to show it to you.
I'm curious about that book actually though. Is it like a sequence of sort of peep shows? Because there's books where sort of like there's pages and then there's like ones that pull out like within the pages, or is it like a single? It's not a codex.
I'm sorry, Brian. Frank should answer the question about Wizard of Oz, but it occurred to me that we do have one that has multiple peep shows in it. So Robert Sabuta's Alice in Wonderland. There's the tunnel. You pull out the thing and you look down it, and it's got kind of a peep show scene. And then you flip it over, and there's at least one more of those particular constructions in it. It's not exactly the same thing as a different story, but I mean that's a story that has a peep show aspect on a couple of the pages.
Brian and I were just talking with my mic muted, and he said that basically, Anne, yes, you put a thumbs up as you were talking, saying, yeah, that's basically what's going on. So you've got the explanation that he was thinking of.
Cool.
I've got to scroll up to get to a question here. Give me 1 second. Are there any specific types of teachers that should include pop-up books in their classrooms? The person gives examples like elementary or special ed, specialists, etc.
I would have. It depends on the. I mean, in pop-up books generically, sure, probably all teachers could find a pop-up book that could work. I mean, for the sake of education, I would think pop-ups could be used over multiple in multiple scenarios to be useful in different ways. If you were using them in, say, early L, for example, you might want to have a really robust one because some of them are pretty fragile. I just ordered a new one, and as we opened it, the paper tore, and I thought, okay, well, this is not one of the ones that you would want to have in an elementary school. There probably are some of them that would be a little bit more robust. I think actually Robert Sabuta's stuff is usually pretty strong. Some of Matthew Reinhardt's books are really created for younger readers, and I got the sense from what we looked at that they were relatively robust.
I think there's a whole set or kind of pop-up book too that is in fact designed for literacy development. So alphabet books, for example, right? Where you'll have, a picture of an apple, you lift the flap to get the letter, right? Or the reverse, right? The letter A and then you lift it to get the sound, right? A for apple. And there's a number of different kinds of books that seem to be designed with the purpose of learning, learning information or concepts or ideas. In addition to, again, like other kinds of learning, to go back to my weird example of, like medical knowledge, or to learn how a building is built, or, what a flower might look like close up, or how the wings of a bird attach. All of those kinds of different pieces of knowledge that, well, books contain in various ways.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question that asks, when did the shift from artistic or useful adultish mechanical books to more children-centered mechanical books happen? And why did that happen?
Go ahead. We're going to answer the same thing. So.
Yeah, it happened, in late 18th, early 19th century. And, for the reason that anything happens, somebody wanted to make some money.
Okay, maybe not exactly the same thing. Yeah, I think that's the practical reason.
Right. I mean, you have booksellers who are, thinking about like, what can they do in order to sell books? And they think this is something that would be interesting. Right. And then it dovetails with, for example, I mentioned earlier in some of the scholarship, people will talk about, John Locke's theories of education and how, John Locke was kind of anti-reading. He thought that the way that kids needed to grow and develop was through interactions with the world around them. But you can't always have interactions with the world around you for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that interactive books do is they provide simulations of interactions with the world around you. And so sort of the coming together of philosophies of childhood, what they needed, and theories of education at a time when booksellers are looking around thinking, what can I do? What can my niche be? Right? Sort of came together in an interesting way to bring pop-ups into children's books.
And then the thing that goes along with that, which I think we're in certain ways taking for granted, I would make the argument that the movement of pop-up books into children's literature corresponds with the movement of literature for everybody into literature for children as well. So we've got 1745, a little pretty pocket book. Suddenly we've got books just for children, books that have delight as well as instruction. And so I think this is happening at the same time. Then you hit the 19th century and all of a sudden there's a middle class money that has children that maybe they're teaching how to read, or maybe they're not teaching how to read, but they're hoping that the children will learn how to read, or if they get interested in books, if it's something that's fun, maybe that will also educate them. Yes.
Okay, this is a fairly detailed question. It's about Nick Bantock was mentioned, and I wondered how you might classify his Griffin and Sabine books. Did I pronounce that correctly? They're not pop-ups, but they have paper mechanics with interactive parts.
Yeah, I would love to say that this was a seated question. Thanks, Tracy. I love Nick Bantock's work, and so possibly one of the reasons that we included 2 books of his in the exhibit is because I really like his work a whole lot. I would argue that the Griffin and Sabine books, for those of you who haven't read them, A, they are gorgeous, and B, they're a series of letters and postcards written from one person to another person that have envelopes that you paste it inside the book, and you open the envelope and take the letter out and read it and put it back. So they're very interactive. They, I think, belong in that area of other kinds of pop-up books. They don't necessarily pop up, but they're movable books, and the bigger classification, I suppose, is movable books. They're a type of movable book because of that interactiveness. They actually post-date a book that was written by Janet and Ellen Alberg called The Jolly Postman, which I think is the 80s, and the Griffin and Sabine books are maybe the early 1990s. I don't have an exact date in front of me. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Answers it for me. And by the way, Tracy does thank you. Okay, this is a variant on what's your favorite child? Which was your favorite pop-up that you came across that didn't make it into the exhibit?
Funnily enough, we both thought about that. You want to go first?
We talked about this as well, and I ended up with a kind of non-answer because my answer is that there were so many. I in fact I pulled this. I have a list of about 4 pages of all of my favorite books from the ones that I looked at, and it goes on and it goes on. Things with 3 and 4. No, I like this one even more, so I had to add an extra star. In the end, though, I feel like in doing this project that I benefited in some ways in other ways. Like in the spring, I taught an adaptation course, and because I'd spent the previous summer and fall really working on this pop-up stuff, I was able to fold quite a bit of things that I learned into that particular course. And it ended up getting scuppered, but Matthew Reinhardt was supposed to come to that class and was going to talk about some of the adaptations that he does, because that's one of the major things he does in his work. So he has a pop-up pop-up Hogwarts we were going to look at. We were going to look at a pop-up World of Warcraft that he does. We also, in that class, I had some stuff set up to do with Poe. One of the other things I study is 19th century literature, and so we read some Poe short stories. We looked at this graphic novel designed for teenagers about Poe. And then we also took a look at a pop-up version of The Raven. And so, like, how do these, different books represent a similar story? What are their aspects of their medium that offer different things in relationship to what we all think we know. So that was sort of one of my favorite things that I got out of doing this work. And again, but like identifying any single book as, Anne's probably going to tell you in a second, but she bought quite a few books. I didn't buy a single one. I told myself when I was looking at the books that there were too many and I couldn't afford all that I wanted, so I could buy none. But Anne, what was your favorite?
Yeah, well, my favorite, I don't have a favorite because there are still many, many more that I like. There were people I particularly liked. I found I was very charmed by Anouk Wachabert, and so I bought a few of hers. This was an expensive thing to be working on, just for the record, Frank. But one thing that didn't make it in, and I pulled it because I fell in love with this author last summer, actually. One of hers, and I keep thinking of him as a her. Susumu Shingo, right? Remember I talked about the sculpture artist. He's the one who did Le Voyage de Ban. He's a Japanese artist whose pop-up books seem to be published almost exclusively in French, at least of the languages that I can read. So this one, Un petit boîte mystérieux, so a little mysterious box. I bought this and it did not make it in, but the other one made it in. But this one, after we made the other one in, this one opens. And this is just amazing, and it doesn't look that amazing, but the thing that I noticed about it is that it moves, and he's inspired by wind, and when you open up his pop-ups, they just sort of keep moving, even if you're not moving them. And I think that's remarkable. So, I mean, he's got other interesting ones, but it's a frog. Not sure which way to look at it. I really like the way that he looks at things. So, yeah, rather than looking at story, I ended up being charmed by some of the art in the pop-ups. And I mean, his story, I can read this, it's not even a story, it just sort of, it doesn't even say much. It's something like le tapis de fleurs, quel doux parfum. So the carpet of flowers, what a sweet perfume. It doesn't really say any kind of a story. So I was intrigued by his work. He's done non-pop-up work as well, but I think out of the many that I was buying, the somewhat fewer that I purchased, I probably now have one shelf more of pop-up books than I had before because I like them anyway. He's the one that really got my attention amidst everybody else that's in there.
That's always the problem with collections. I will mention, by the way, for those of you who are listening, that our distinguished guests were paid the usual high rate of pay that Clarke guest curators get. Actually, they didn't even get that. Usually they get their first choice of food at the reception, but the reception got canceled because of COVID-19, so they didn't even get a free reception dinner out of it. It was really kind of a crummy deal.
Frank, it wasn't. This was actually a joy to work on, right? I mean, this is a kind of book, again, that is designed to like delight people. And when they do their job well, right, really, they do their job well. And it was just such a beautiful and uplifting and fun thing to get to do.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yes, and to go in there and have the privilege of playing with all of these movable books. And knowing that we were working at the same time, because we were working, I mean, we were evaluating them, but that doesn't mean you can't enjoy your job. So it was a delight to work on.
And I can't emphasize enough that this isn't something that's just available as a thing for, like Anne and I who curated this particular exhibit, but this is a research collection. And there are so many interesting things that are part of that collection. For example, there's an extensive set of those Hallmark books from the 70s and 80s, and they're pretty fascinating. The range of things that they cover, the mechanics that they work, and in fact, the sort of what Hallmark thought it was doing in producing those books and the ideological messages it was putting forward into the world. And they're a cheap kind of pop-up book. They're not like, one of the fancy ones that costs a lot of money, but they were meant to circulate widely. And what's being said through them. But nobody's talked about things like that. So someone in the audience could go and do that work.
Pop-ups.
Well, I have a few more questions for you from the audience. One is, are there other pop-up books that are able to take inspiration from elements or have another inspirational design like, oh, don't give me a French phrase. My French is horrible. Un petit bois mysteria.
It was that horrible. Are there other, what was the question? Are there other ones?
Are there other pop-ups that take inspiration from elements or have from the elements or have other inspirational design?
I'm now mentally going through the, yeah.
Well, Matthew Reinhardt has two of his earliest books were about trying to upset people. They were the phobia books, and so like, yeah, the inspiration is, you know, spiders and you know. Go ahead, Anne.
I did dentists. There's a reason that book is not in the slideshow that I showed people. It's really scary.
So like the inspiration of creating shivers, if you will, which it did very well.
Yeah,
all right, well, on that theme, let me ask another question. Were there any books that you had big expectations for, but were just kind of underwhelmed when you actually got to the book?
Oh.
And I think you should talk about the sex books.
Yeah, there weren't many of those, but yeah, they were surprisingly uninteresting. There's one called, I think it's just the pop-up book of sex, which was, it was interesting, but weirdly offensive. It looked like it was something created in the 1930s. And we both assumed it was created in the 1930s because of the way that it was viewing women. And then we discovered it's much more recent. So that was a little disturbing. I know there were others that.
There's a book, Karma Sutra, which you know, we thought like, you know, if done well could be interesting, but like really, because one of our initial thoughts was that we wanted to include a section in the exhibit that was about things that most people don't think of when they think of pop-up books. So things that were more adult, and of course, when you think of adult stuff, you immediately think of the sexy things, and there's quite a number of those books in the collection, but frankly, almost to a one, they were disappointing.
Yeah.
Like poorly done, messy.
I'm not saving you here. You guys brought it up. You fix it.
I mean, it's interesting. It was interesting that they existed. But I mean, the Kama Sutra one in particular, that had a lot of potential, I thought, in theory.
To be beautiful.
Had a lot of potential, yeah, yeah. And yet, as a pop-up, it was just like, hey. Oh, I know the other one though. The one that I was really expecting to like was the pop-up MC Escher, and it was underwhelming. I think because since those are illusions that are drawn in two-dimensional art, once they're rendered in three-dimensional art, a lot of the charm vanishes. And so that one I really did have high hopes for. And it simply did not work. It wasn't that interesting. And even the things that I like about MC Escher didn't seem to work well as pop-ups. We didn't have time, so I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about why.
I felt like it was with the art books, almost all of them more like cut out pieces of the art to try and make it look dimensional rather than making the art itself three-dimensional, which was just weird. It just didn't work.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure there were others. But
talking about what worked, I have a question. I don't know if you two did this or you probably did it in collaboration with Janet Danick, but how did you decide on the large display images for the exhibit? I gather there was a lot of interesting and impressive artistic options to choose from.
Oh.
Why those?
From my memory, that was Janet. I think Janet, I'm sure she said to us, what do you think of this? And then I think we just kind of said, sure.
As I remember, she had actually picked a different scene from The Wizard of Oz. Oh no, she had done an Alice in Wonderland, and it was going to be she wanted the cards, right, and then to have the cards on the floor. Yeah. I don't remember why we asked her to do the Wizard of Oz instead.
I do, and I'm not sure if he's logged in. The Wizard of Oz is books that's really close to Francis Molson's heart. He really loves Wizard of Oz. And since there is a good collection of Wizard of Oz books in the Clarke, there are several pop-up versions, but there are many, many other non-pop-up versions as well. And since there was a case that was dedicated to Francis's favorites, and since that case was going to work best by the door, I think that's why we ended up going with that. Because it's the yellow brick road. So
yes, that's why we ended up going with that. We, as part of our thank you to Francis, said pick a couple favorites, and The Wizard of Oz came up. He's always loved that story. It's been one of his favorites for years. He's collected anything and everything Wizard of Oz, given it to the Clarke. So that the other issue we had with that image you were talking about, the cards. There are mechanical issues in trying to make these things work in the real world when you go from a book that is paper to a physical object like those exhibits. Those cards turned out to be particularly tricky objects. We were using various three-dimensional tools to do this, and we ran into some issues with that one. So there's one of the things when you're doing exhibits, which you alluded to in your presentation, is there's some mechanical limitations. A case is only so tall. If you want a book that's 3 inches taller, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter what the intellectual merit is, it's just not going to work. Now, we did some workarounds for that to do some things, but there are some mechanical problems you run into in exhibit design. I have one other question for you. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. Will the future of pop-up and movable books be affected by the fact that the tablets tablets are now making their way into children's life and education? I assume, Apple tablets we're talking about here.
Yeah, Apple's iPads. We haven't talked about that. I have a knee-jerk response, which is, of course not, because they're fun. I mean, there was the big conversation 10 years ago, maybe less. Will Kindles, will tablet readers replace books? And it turns out that no, they haven't. They've added things. I love reading paper books, but I will read on my Kindle at night because I can read in the dark. And I don't have to get up and turn off the light. But I don't think that pop-ups will suddenly vanish because of tablets or Kindles. This is where the surprise and wonder, they're too much fun. There's something just really delightful about having that tactile experience of opening a book and seeing something twizzle around or something literally pop up that you don't expect. And then there's the fascination of figuring out how it works. So, you're opening and closing it and looking at it from different angles. I don't personally think that can be replicated by an iPad or by a tablet. An iPad or tablet can do different things, but it can't do that. What do you think?
I think that the tablets add a different kind of interactiveness to the broad stretch of interactive books, so I think it expands rather than replaces what we think about when we're thinking about movable books. And one of the things that video game people will talk about when they're talking about the interactiveness of video games is how there's this intermediary kind of process that has to happen, and it happens in the brain. Because when you're moving something on the screen, right, it's different than if you're moving it with your hand. And so your brain has to make this translation. And it's only when you start playing a new game and you're learning the new mechanics of a game, it takes a little while to get used to sort of when I do this, it means that happens, which is very different than if you have a pop-up book and you pull a tab and the thing comes up. Right. It's just a different kind of interaction, and they both have important places in the world and in our times, but I don't think one can replace the other.
Okay, thank you. Well, that is all the questions I have. Do either of you have any last words you want to share with the audience?
Come and see the exhibit in person because you only got tiny snippets of it. There are so many more things to see.
Look at the Terry catalog, find other things you want to look at as well. I mean, it's really, a wonderful thing to do on a rainy afternoon or a sunny afternoon or just any afternoon.
And if you'd like to do that, please just either email the Clarke Library or call us at 774-3352. We are making appointments. We're limiting the visitors to the room to 4 unrelated individuals at a time for the exhibit. But the phrase has worked into our linguistics that we are accepting pods. Pods being groups of people who live together. So if there's a group of you who want to come and you live together, we can make that happen. But please do give us a phone call or an email message, and we will work out time when you can see the exhibit. I'd like to thank both of you for the presentation. It was really very interesting. I'd also like to thank you both for being our shameless promotion division for Matthew Reinhardt next Thursday. I hope all of you who are listening tonight will also join us for Matthew Reinhardt's presentation. Thank you all. We're done for the evening. Good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Frank.